What happened to the Christian nuns when the Ottoman armies arrived is a story most of history tried to hide. It's brutal, it's shocking, and it will haunt you. In the quiet corners of Eastern Europe, monasteries stood like islands of peace. Inside, Christian nuns lived lives of prayer and devotion. Their days were simple: chanting, meditation, tending the sick, and preserving ancient traditions. Stone walls, candlelit halls, and sacred gardens made these monasteries feel untouchable. For centuries, they were safe, untouched, sacred. But that peace was about to end. The Ottoman Empire was expanding. Armies swept across lands like a storm. Villages fell, towns burned, and the monasteries? They were next. For the nuns, the first sign of danger came as whispers. Travelers spoke of soldiers on the roads. Rumors spread of towns raided, homes destroyed, families torn apart. The nuns prayed harder, hoping their prayers could shield them. Then the soldiers arrived. No warning, no mercy. The gates were broken. Fear spread like wildfire. Women who had spent their lives in devotion now faced soldiers with steel and fire in their eyes. Many tried to hide in the bell towers or behind thick walls, but the army was relentless. Sisters were separated. Panic replaced prayer. Some clutched their rosaries and whispered silent pleas. Others fell to their knees, hoping for a miracle. In the chaos, it wasn't just the threat of death that terrified them, it was the unknown. The soldiers did not see these women as nuns. They saw captives, objects, pawns in a larger, merciless game. For some, the monastery that had been a sanctuary became a prison. Locked in cells, stripped of comfort, watched every second by guards. The nuns faced a world they had never imagined. And this was only the beginning. Soon, their lives of quiet devotion would collide with a nightmare so dark it would test their faith, their courage, and their very humanity. The nuns who survived this first day would carry memories that would last a lifetime. And those who did not, their stories were almost erased from history. But today, we bring them back. Because what the Ottomans did to these women was worse than anything you could imagine. And it all started here, in the monasteries that were supposed to be safe. The morning after the attack, the monasteries were in ruins. Silence hung heavy, but not the peaceful kind. This was the silence of fear, of shock, of despair. The nuns huddled together, their faces pale, their hearts racing. They didn't know who would survive. They didn't know what the soldiers wanted. All they knew was terror. The Ottoman army wasn't interested in prayers or mercy. They wanted control, and they wanted the women. Soldiers stormed the halls, breaking doors and searching every corner. Nuns were dragged from their cells, their robes torn. The sacred silence of centuries shattered in screams. Some tried to fight. A handful grabbed candles, sticks, anything they could find. But it was hopeless. The soldiers were armed, ruthless, and merciless. Resistance meant punishment, and the punishment was cruel. Families nearby had already witnessed horrors: women beaten, children taken, homes destroyed. Now the nuns were experiencing the same fate. But there was something worse looming. The nuns weren't just prisoners. They were targets for a system that saw them as spoils of war. The captives were separated immediately. Older nuns, younger nuns, stronger ones, weaker ones. No one knew why, but it didn't matter. Each group faced a fate worse than they could imagine. The soldiers didn't speak of mercy. Only orders, only fear, only control. Those who resisted were punished publicly. Whispers of horror spread through the monastery. Women who had lived their whole lives in prayer now faced humiliation, violence, and threats to their faith. The nuns were marched out in the open. Some stumbled. Some cried. The soldiers laughed, indifferent to their suffering. Villagers watched, helpless, as centuries of faith and devotion were trampled under the boots of an empire. The march wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Stripped of freedom, stripped of choice, the nuns were forced to obey, to follow, to fear. Each step took them further from their home, further from safety, further from hope. At night, the nuns huddled together, whispering prayers that felt hollow. Guards patrolled endlessly. Any movement, any sound could bring punishment. Sleep was impossible. Fear was constant. The walls of their minds closed in faster than the walls of the monastery ever could. And yet, some nuns held on. They whispered courage to each other, shared small acts of defiance, clung to faith like a lifeline. But even their courage couldn't shield them from what was coming next. Because capture was only the beginning. The horrors that lay ahead would test every belief, every ounce of strength, and every shred of humanity they had left. The nuns didn't know it yet, but their world had changed forever, and the Ottoman nightmare had only just begun. The nuns had been captured, but the nightmare was far from over. Once inside the Ottoman camps, the reality hit them like a cold, merciless wave. The air was thick with fear, sweat, and the scent of smoke. Every step they took was watched. Every word they whispered could bring punishment. They were stripped of their robes, their sacred symbols, even the small comforts that tied them to their faith. They were given new clothes, rough, uncomfortable, humiliating. Clothes that marked them as prisoners, not women of God. The nuns were separated even further. Older sisters from younger ones, stronger women from the weak. Each group taken to different cells or tents, isolated, afraid, and alone. The confinement was brutal. Some were locked in small, dark rooms with no light. Rats and insects were constant companions. Food was minimal. Stale bread, sour water, whatever the soldiers allowed. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but fear gnawed at their hearts even more. The walls were not just physical, they were psychological. Guards prowled day and night, watching every movement. A whisper, a glance, even a sigh could bring a lash or worse. The nuns began to understand the cruel logic of their captors. Break their spirits, tear them from their faith, turn their devotion into despair. Some tried to pray in secret, a soft murmur of a hymn behind a locked door, a whispered plea to God under the cover of night. But even this was dangerous. Guards could appear without warning. A misstep, and the punishment would be swift. And the psychological torment didn't end there. The soldiers used fear as a weapon. They spread rumors, threatened the sisters with disappearances, with violence, with horrors too terrible to imagine. Every day brought new threats. Every night brought new terror. Yet, even in the darkest cells, some nuns refused to surrender. They held on to fragments of hope. A glance exchanged with a sister, a secret prayer, a quiet act of defiance. But courage came at a cost. Many were broken. Some lost their faith. Some couldn't survive the fear. And some simply disappeared, taken to places no one dared speak of. It was a cruel, relentless system. The nuns were no longer just captives. They were tools, objects of power, symbols of conquest. Every moment of confinement was a test of endurance, of humanity, and of faith. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Because what the soldiers had planned next was far more sinister. The nuns would soon face choices no human should ever have to make. Their lives, their faith, their very souls, all hanging by a thread. The monastery that had once been their sanctuary was gone. Their world had been replaced by fear, brutality, and a merciless empire that saw nothing sacred. And for these women, survival meant facing horrors beyond imagining. The story was no longer about peace. It was about endurance, about suffering, about the fight to remain human in the face of unimaginable cruelty. And for the nuns, every day in captivity would bring them closer to a truth they were not ready for. Confinement was only the beginning. What came next was far worse. The nuns were taken from their cells and marched deeper into the empire's reach. Their lives of devotion, prayer, and peace had been ripped away. What awaited them was a world where fear ruled, and mercy did not exist. Some were forced into servitude in the palaces of powerful Ottoman officials. They cleaned floors, cooked meals, and obeyed every command, no matter how degrading. Their sacred vows meant nothing here. Their prayers were ignored, their cries unheard. Others faced a different, darker reality. They were treated as spoils of war, symbols of conquest. Humiliation, coercion, and threats became their daily companions. Sisters who had spent decades in quiet devotion were now trapped in a system designed to break their spirit. The psychological torment was relentless. Guards spread lies, whispered threats, and played on fear. Disobey, and you will never see daylight again. Resist, and your sisters will vanish before your eyes. Every word was calculated to destroy hope. Some nuns clung desperately to faith, whispering prayers in secret corners, sharing tiny glimmers of courage with each other. Others weren't strong enough. Fear, hunger, and despair corroded their resolve. And yet, even in the darkest moments, acts of bravery emerged. A sister would secretly slip a morsel of bread to another. A whispered warning saved someone from punishment. A hidden hymn gave them a fleeting sense of freedom. But the cruelty of their captors escalated. The nuns were forced to witness horrors they could barely comprehend. Sisters disappeared overnight, taken to places they dared not name. Rumors spread of women sold, abused, or executed. Every morning, those who remained woke to a new fear, a new threat, a new nightmare. The once sacred walls of the monastery, now far behind them, seemed like a distant dream. Their world had been replaced by cages, palaces, and dark corridors where every step was a test of endurance. For some, survival meant surrendering a piece of themselves. Their dignity, their freedom, even their faith, every day demanded a sacrifice. And still, a few resisted, holding on to belief and courage as tightly as they could. The Ottomans weren't just conquering land, they were conquering hearts and spirits. Every act of cruelty, every threat, every humiliation was meant to erase who these women were, to erase the faith that had guided them for decades. And yet, despite it all, whispers of rebellion and escape began to grow. Secret messages, daring plans, and quiet acts of defiance took shape among the sisters. Because even in the darkest shadow, hope refuses to die. The nuns had endured confinement. They had survived the humiliation. They had faced horrors beyond imagination. But the ultimate test was still ahead. The choice between survival and the impossible cost of staying true to their faith. And when that choice came, it would change everything. Even in the darkest prisons, hope has a way of surviving. Some nuns refused to be broken. They whispered plans in secret corners, passed messages hidden in laundry, and shared knowledge of guards' routines. Every glance, every gesture became a code. Their faith was now a weapon, a lifeline in a world that tried to destroy them. The first attempts at escape were small, almost desperate. One sister slipped through a hallway when a guard dozed. Another hid in a pile of laundry to avoid notice. But the consequences were brutal. Those caught were punished publicly, beaten, humiliated. Fear hung heavier than ever, but it did not silence them. Word of these small acts of defiance spread. Courage became contagious. Sisters who had given up hope now whispered, "We can survive. We can escape." The journey to freedom was never simple. The nuns faced dark forests, rivers, and hostile villages. Ottoman patrols were everywhere, watching for fugitives, ready to capture anyone daring enough to run. Every step was a gamble. Every sound could mean death. And yet, desperation fueled ingenuity. They disguised themselves, blended into markets, posed as servants. Every trick was a test of nerves and faith. They learned quickly that survival meant thinking like the oppressors while staying true to themselves. But the psychological toll was immense. Some sisters lost their way, overcome by fear or exhaustion. Others were recaptured, their punishment a stark reminder of the empire's cruelty. Yet even those who returned to captivity told tales that inspired others. Every attempt, every risk, became part of a growing legend of resilience. And then there were those rare few who truly escaped. They crossed borders, found sympathetic villages, and eventually reached monasteries far from Ottoman control. Their stories were filled with fear, loss, and sorrow, but also with relief, courage, and faith that had never been fully extinguished. Even in freedom, they carried scars, some visible, some hidden deep within. But they also carried knowledge. They knew the horrors the nuns had endured. They knew the strength it took to survive. And they knew that the empire's cruelty would not erase the memory of what they had endured. These survivors returned to share their stories, to warn others, and to honor those who did not survive. Their testimonies revealed the unimaginable horrors of the Ottoman captivity. Not just the physical suffering, but the psychological torment, the humiliation, and the relentless attempts to break faith and spirit. For the nuns, survival was more than escape. It was defiance. It was courage. It was a refusal to let fear, oppression, and cruelty erase their identity, their faith, and their humanity. The monasteries they returned to were no longer untouched islands of peace. But through their stories, prayers, and courage, a legacy emerged, a testament to endurance, resistance, and the unbreakable human spirit. Because even when faced with horrors worse than anyone could imagine, some souls refused to be conquered. And their fight, their suffering, and their survival would be remembered for centuries to come. The horrors were over, but the echoes of fear lingered. The nuns who survived returned to their monasteries, but nothing was the same. The walls they once called sacred now carried memories of screams, confinement, and terror. Their gardens, once serene, now seemed haunted by the shadows of the past. Yet, amidst the devastation, something remarkable endured. Their faith, their courage, and their stories. These survivors became living witnesses. They shared the horrors of captivity, the terror of the soldiers, and the relentless psychological torment. They spoke of sisters lost forever, of prayers whispered in darkness, of courage that refused to die even when every moment screamed despair. Their testimonies painted a picture history had tried to forget, a story of cruelty so profound that it could almost seem unreal. Yet it was true, and it was necessary. The nuns' legacy was not only survival, it was defiance. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable oppression, the human spirit can endure. They taught that faith is not just a ritual, it is a lifeline, a weapon, a shield against the darkest of nights. For generations to come, these stories would inspire those who faced injustice, fear, or cruelty. The courage of the nuns became a symbol that even when empires rise and fall, when walls are shattered and lives are taken, the spirit of the brave endures. History may have tried to silence them. Many accounts were lost, hidden, or forgotten, but the memory remained. And through retelling, the world remembered. We remember the fear, the pain, the despair. But more importantly, we remember the courage. The nuns who whispered prayers in the dark, who dared to resist, who ran when escape was their only hope. These women became legends, and their story leaves a chilling truth. History is filled with shadows, with horrors that we cannot always comprehend. But within those shadows the light of human resilience shines the brightest. The monasteries may have been scarred, but so were the hearts of the survivors, and those scars carried strength. The nun's ordeal reminds us of the cost of faith, the price of courage, and the power of endurance. What the Ottomans did to these women was worse than anyone could imagine. But in the end, the nuns survived, and their spirit could never be conquered. Their story is a warning. Their story is a testament. Their story is a legacy of pain and of unbreakable courage. Because some horrors cannot be erased, some spirits cannot be broken, and some stories demand to be remembered.